Hey everybody, Luke Thomas here for Morning Kombat. Wanted to get a reaction up. I know we're just a few hours away at this point from the start of UFC 290, but we have some news about a little bit later in the calendar that's worth getting up here just a little bit. So let's talk about it. UFC 295, which will be 11/11 of this year, so November 11th. At Madison Square Garden, it's going to be Jon Jones taking on Stipe Miocic. Dana White had made an announcement yesterday about this, and so we wanted to talk about it here just a little bit on Morning Kombat if we could. Pretty big news. Pretty big news for the heavyweight division. So first of all, it's actually going to be the 30th anniversary of UFC 1, which is really interesting that they're putting a fight, frankly, one of the bigger fights the UFC can make, basically, on a hallowed date in not just the organization's history, but certainly MMA history as well. Also, we all know Jon Jones, originally from Endicott, New York, originally was with Team Bomb Squad. He is from the New York area. So I wouldn't call this quite a homecoming, but certainly he has New York roots. So putting it in Madison Square Garden on this anniversary date is just going to be a really big and grand occasion. Also, it's the return of Stipe Miocic, who hasn't fought in almost, and by that time anyway, almost 3 years he'll have been off. He currently sits at 41 years of age. Jon Jones, I think, about 36. So this might be in a couple of different... Actually, here's something to think about. You could get a double retirement on that Saturday night. I mean, think about what Jon Jones has said. Like, you might get the 2 fights and then nothing really else after that. We don't really know. So he could beat Stipe and then just decide what else really is there for me and then call it a day. Stipe, by the way, if he loses, is he really going to stick around and maybe get another one? I suppose that if there's a fight where Jon wins and it's extremely controversial, they might run it back, or vice versa. So in the event that there is some kind of disaster in the main event, or who knows? Who knows what it could be? They might run it back. But short of that, there is a good possibility not merely you'll get 1 retirement on that night, but potentially 2. Now, I know what some folks have said. It's like, well, okay, well, it's great that Jon is fighting Stipe Miocic. I mean, that's not anything to complain about. And if Jon Jones wins that, he'll have beaten Cormier, previous heavyweight champion. He'll have beaten Ngannou, who, of course, was the interim champion. And then he'll have beaten, obviously, Miocic at that point. It's 3 of the last 4 champs, the one that everyone really wants to see in Francis. We know it's not going to happen, at least not anytime soon or ever. But the point I wanted to make here is I know some folks were thinking, oh, I would love to get Sergei Pavlovich in there against Jon Jones. And yeah, I think that fight would have had a lot of impact for the hardcore fan base. I mean, about that, there really can be no doubt. And also, just categorically, it's a more interesting fight. Pavlovich is on the rise. Jon Jones had a fight against Ngannou that was really not in any way competitive. That seems like a much more interesting fight because here comes Jon Jones with all the size and the bulk and the experience taking on this new generation of heavyweight killers, leading with Sergei Pavlovich. Fair enough. But, it just doesn't seem from a business standpoint that's a fight that makes a lot of sense. Number one, you still have Stipe with this unresolved need to fight. He's been on ice. If he's going to come back, it's only going to be under one of these occasions. Also, Jon versus Stipe is just going to sell a lot more than Jon versus Sergei. Especially on a grand occasion like this. Not that Stipe has ever been a hardcore box office attraction. That would be overstating it, and I don't think it's necessarily a huge difference, but there probably is one. And more to the point, if you're Jon Jones, just ask yourself who has a bigger name. I mean, the answer is quite obviously going to be Stipe Miocic between the two. He is a previous champion. It's just going to mean more, at least when you see the name on the resume, than a Sergei Pavlovich. But it should be noted there is definitely I would say on the smaller side, but a noticeable amount of people who feel a little bit differently, and they would have loved to have seen the Pavlovich fight instead of the Miocic fight. And also, I understand one more part of that criticism, which is, well, what does it mean if Jon beats a 41, nearly 42-year-old Miocic, who's been off for nearly 3 years, versus beating him, when he was 36 or whatever? They're fair criticisms, but it's a fight business, and I think that's going to dictate how some of the fights get made and when they get made and against who. Whether we like that or not, it is a reality of the fight game. Now, there is one more piece of this puzzle that is actually kind of interesting. On the same day, maybe like an hour or 2 before, Ariel Helwani had reported that a boxing match, or some kind of bout, we'll get to that in just a second, between Tyson Fury and former UFC heavyweight champion, now PFL standout to a degree, Francis Ngannou, right? So Fury versus Ngannou are going to fight in likely a boxing contest. Now, I say likely because, number one, it hasn't been fully reported what the details are going to be. We're only going off some speculation, some of what has been reported, and some of what has been speculated in the reporting, namely that it could be an exhibition bout, there could be 4-ounce gloves, there could be a lot of different rules that get introduced into a contest like that. We also don't know where it might be and when it might be, although we did know that Francis had kind of set aside the rest of 2023 to get a boxing match before returning to MMA in 2024. So it still fits some of those broader timelines. And of course, it could take place in the UK, but it seems like there's been some discussions both on the Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder side in conjunction with Usyk and Fury and this about taking some of these fights to Saudi Arabia where you're going to get a lot of the bigger bankrolls. We shall see. But the part that's kind of interesting to me is, we often express on MK some skepticism when Dana White announces fights, not to be dicks about it, but just because we can't be overly sure that whenever he announces it, it's true, because oftentimes he'll do that and then we find out that there's only certain verbal promises in place, or even not necessarily that, much less a written contract. But I don't even want to focus on that. I just want to focus on the fact that there was this report that Ngannou was probably going to be boxing Fury. There was going to be an announcement very soon. And then right thereafter is this announcement between Jones and Miocic. And by the way, it's all on a Friday, which was like, Friday is typically, though not always, and granted things are a little bit different because it's fight week, people are in Vegas, it's going to change the equation a little bit. But Friday is usually where folks announce bad news, right? Because you want to dump it at the end of the weekend, and so it kind of dies off. You can start with a fresh cycle on Monday, assuming it's not too bad. It's usually a little bit on the rarer side where you get an introduction for something big on a Friday, although again, it is International Fight Week, it's a Friday, it can be a little bit different in the fight world for that reason. Nevertheless, was it coincidental? Was it not? There simply is no way to know, but I'll just say this. There is a conspicuous pattern of Francis Ngannou making news about either signing with the PFL through the New York Times report or some other kind of thing, and then there is immediately behind it, not always within several hours, but sometimes a day after, where there is now a slate of announcements about big fights that are happening on the horizon for the UFC. Can we say with a definitive, declaration that that's the case here? No, we cannot. You can use your best judgment about whether or not that is true, although here's what I will say, and I do think this is true. Don't know about the Jones-Miocic announcement being directly related to the Fury and Ngannou early-ish report from Helwani, but I will say I do think that Francis making waves outside of the octagon is the sort of thing that's going to get Dana White, UFC president, and that organization to want to more readily compete against that, right? That's the kind of thing that 10 years ago used to really ruffle their feathers, and they would really want to get out there and dampen enthusiasm, or just, put the UFC product first in whatever way that they could, which of course you would expect them to do. So kind of interesting that this sort of semi-hinting of an announcement, however coincidental the timing, still fits this broader pattern we know about them wanting to trample on that news with their own news. And in this particular case, I do think it is a pretty exciting bout. Whether or not it is the most exciting version of what Jon Jones could do with his time is up to you to decide, and how you want to spend your time and money, blah, blah, blah. But on November 11th, 2023, Madison Square Garden, one of the most hallowed institutions in all of the fight game, is going to play host to Jon Jones taking on Stipe Miocic for the UFC Heavyweight Championship. Interesting turn of events. We'll see what happens. We'll have more coverage for you on MK in the week ahead. It's going to be an interesting time this fall and upcoming winter. Can't wait to see what happens. See you guys then.